And finally, let's look at the last of the prohibited acts under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. An example of this may be what happened with Native Americans and also Aborigines in Australia. This includes not just the forcible removal of children, but also the creating of conditions of terror and oppression which lead to the forcible transfer of children from the group to another group. And it has to be established that the children are of the targeted group and there is an intent to transfer them. E is the closest to the quote-unquote cultural genocide that there is in the convention, but the Genocide Convention does not criminalize cultural genocide, which is essentially the genocide by elimination of cultural attributes, one of which might be suppression of language, versus the physical destruction of the group, which is what the Genocide Convention does prohibit. Cultural genocide is often associated with acts directed towards indigenous groups or minorities, including forced assimilation of the Aborigines in Australia, the Maoris of New Zealand, and suppression of the culture of Native Americans in the New World. The current situation of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province in China may also have the hallmarks of cultural genocide, as well as a number of other internationally recognized crimes. No court has yet to proclaim an instance of cultural genocide, but the issue continues to be hotly debated. It traditionally goes that the suppression of cultural attributes does not raise the level of physical destruction, which again is the main aim of the Genocide Convention. So we've gone over the first of the two requirements for the crime of genocide, the actus reus, the prohibited acts A through E in Article 2 that are the physical acts of the crime. The second requirement is the mental requirement, the mens rea of genocide. This is reflected in Article 2 when it says the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Because the underlying physical acts are not international crimes, the specific intent is what distinguishes genocide from the ordinary crime of murder. It is the most important task of proving a genocidal claim. Here it's important to distinguish between political uses of the term genocide, actions directed towards religious minorities and ethnic groups, and the convention requirement of the intent to destroy. This requires two things. One, a general intent to commit acts listed in Article 2A through E, plus 2, specific intent dolus specialis to commit the acts listed in Article 2A through E with intent to destroy. Think of the first requirement as intent against the particular victim, and the second requirement as intent against the group. The destruction must be physical or biological. It can include physical severing of bonds. The motive for someone's commission of genocide does not matter. It could be for economic reasons, out of hatred, personal motive, but the focus needs to just be on the intent. And to prove the crime of genocide, it must be beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a criminal standard of proof. If there is no direct evidence relating to the commission of the genocide, it must be the only reasonable inference to be drawn from the evidence. This is particularly important when it comes to looking at genocide in the context of military operations, because not every military operation amounts to genocide. And if there is no direct evidence, it needs to be the only reasonable inference from the evidence. An example on indirect findings relating to genocide is in the Krstich case relating to the alleged and then ultimately found instance of genocide that occurred at Srebrenica during the conflicts in the Balkans. All the evidence was indirect, and the trial court had to draw inferences with the evidence. So the massacre by the army of all men of military age from that community was the allegation of genocide. And the trial court rejected the defense's argument that they were all potential military threats because in executing the captured Bosnian Muslim men, the military did not differentiate between men of military status and civilians. Though civilians undoubtedly are capable of bearing arms, they do not constitute the same kind of military threat as professional soldiers. By killing civilian prisoners, the Army did not intend only to eliminate them as a military danger. In addition, the trial court found that some of the victims were severely handicapped, and for that reason unlikely to have been combatants, supporting the conclusion that the extermination of these men was not driven solely by a military rationale. And finally, the trial court considered the long-term impact of the elimination of 7,000 to 8,000 men from Srebrenica would have likely had on the community's physical survival. The massacred men amounted to about 20% of the overall Srebrenica community, and given the patriarchal character of the Bosnian Muslim society in Srebrenica, the destruction of such a sizable number of men would inevitably result in the physical disappearance of the Bosnian Muslim population at Srebrenica. What is evidence of intent to destroy? It can be direct or indirect, as we discussed, inferred from the circumstances of a crime, but when it's indirect, it has to be the only reasonable inference to be drawn from the evidence. The court in Akayesu at the ICTR said if there is no direct evidence, look for a consistent pattern of conduct. And the ICJ in Bosnia versus Serbia also ascribed this pattern of conduct when it said, the dolus specialis has to be convincingly shown by reference to particular circumstances unless a general plan to that end can be convincingly demonstrated to exist. And for a pattern of conduct to be accepted as evidence of its existence, it would have to be such that it could only point to the existence of such intent. As we just looked at, evidence of genocidal intent for Krstić at the ICTY was all indirect. Looking next to quote, in whole or in part, the focus is meant to be placed on how many persons the perpetrator intended to kill, not how many he actually did. Whole is comparatively easy. It's the intent to destroy the group in its entirety. But what about part? That's more nuanced. How many constitutes a part? The court in Krstić at the ICTY said that intent to destroy must be at least a substantial part of the particular group, numerically or qualitatively, and you should look at the significance of the parts. The court said, quote, if a specific part of the group is emblematic of the overall group or is essential to its survival, that may support a finding that the part qualifies as substantial. The impact that the destruction of the targeted group will have on the overall survival of the group, look at their prominence within the group. Also, examine the geographical area of the accused perpetrator's activity and control, plus the opportunity to extend their reach. The intent to destroy formed by a perpetrator of genocide will always be limited by the opportunity presented to him or her. So it must be substantial enough to have an impact on the group as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. understanding to the Genocide Convention states that the U.S. interprets the in part portion of the definition to mean, quote, insubstantial parts. And when the U.S. codified the crime of genocide from the convention into U.S. law at 18 U.S.C. 1091, it did add the definition of substantial part. And under U.S. law, substantial part means the destruction of such numerical significance, the destruction or loss of that part would cause the destruction of the group as a viable entity within the nation of which such a group was a part. Looking next at the protected group of genocide, as stated in Article 2 of the Convention definition. This is the, quote, national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, close quote, section. A group cannot be negatively defined. It must have positive characteristics. It's a matter of who people are and not who they are not. So, for example, you can't have a protected group that's defined as, quote, non-Serb national, ethnical, or religious group within but not limited to the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina, including in particular the Muslim population. It should include, quote, any stable and permanent group, as the trial chamber in Akayesu said, but this this term, any stable and permanent group, actually hasn't been very widely adopted. If you look at the first protected group in genocide, national group. For a national group, you look at the group's socioeconomic context. It should be seen in terms of national minorities, but note that the Genocide Convention doesn't just protect minorities, and don't confuse national group with nationality. So genocide at Srebrenica, we're going back to Yugoslavia. Genocide in Srebrenica, what was the group? The indictment charged the destruction of a part of the Bosnian Muslim people as a national, ethnic, or religious group. And the court agreed in Krstić that the Bosnian Muslims were a national group. Within the group, it was the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica that were targeted. So that was the in part portion of the in whole or in part to meet the convention definition of genocide. The ethnical group, protected group, is usually a group whose members share a common language, or a group that distinguishes itself, self-IDs, or a group identified as such by others, including perpetrators of the crime. So the ICTR held that the Tutsi are an ethnical group based upon government-issued ID cards that described Tutsis in that way. The racial group, protected group. At the time of drafting of the Genocide Convention, this was a concept of the time, and according to some scholars, including Schabas, was at the time likely synonymous with national, ethnic, or religious groups. You identify racial groups based on hereditary traits, often identified with geographic regions, irrespective of linguistic, cultural, national, or religious factors. Religious group, protected group. These include denominations or modes of worship of a group sharing common beliefs. In the end, it doesn't really matter as much about putting a situation into one of the most specific groups because it's hard to define the groups. It may be best to kind of just see the four protected groups as an umbrella concept. Religion can change, but the others have some sort of element of permanence. And ultimately, what the courts have said that with respect to protected groups, the determination needs to be made on a case-by-case basis depending on both objective and subjective criteria. The phrase "as such." If you haven't learned already, there are a few instances of where extra words are added into a convention for, stylistic flourish. They usually have a particular meaning and a particular purpose. So at the end of national, ethnical, racial, or religious, there is, quote, "as such." And it's not an accident. It emphasizes that the group is the target. In Bosnia versus Serbia at the ICJ, the court said genocide, quote, requires an intent to destroy a collection of people who have a particular group identity. The, quote, "as such" highlights the protected group as the target rather than the individual in isolation. So this is a way to distinguish mass murder from genocide.